Bismillahirrahmanirrahim and Assalamualaikum and welcome to the Harborne Islamic Study Circle HISC Seerah session 155. So this is the fourth session on issues related to the Battle of Khaybar, and inshallah most of today's session we will talk about one of the marriages of the Prophet ﷺ related to Khaybar. But just a quick recap. Last session we did how the widowed wife of one of the chiefs who was defeated cooked the victor's banquet but poisoned the meat, and then she asked which part of the lamb does the Prophet ﷺ like, and they told him he liked the shoulder, so she put some extra poison on the shoulder. Prophet ﷺ took a morsel of that in his mouth. He didn't swallow, but then he spat it out because the meat had actually spoken to him and said, "I'm poisoned." Then he confronted the tribe, and they admitted that they did poison the food. And then he asked the lady why she did it, and she goes, "Well, if you were a king, and then we would have got rid of you, but if you were a prophet, then God would tell you that it was poisoned." So he let her off, but then one of the other Sahabi who was sitting next to him, who'd also taken a morsel of food, but he'd actually swallowed it, he died a few days later. I think his name was Abu Bishr, but so the lady was put to death because of the fact that he had died. Then we also talked about how the Prophet's cousin had come over from Abyssinia, Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, one of his best mates that he'd sent as the leader of the delegation to live in Abyssinia, and they'd been living there for over 10 years, and this was a small stronghold of Muslims. Should anything catastrophic happen to the Muslims in Makkah and Medina, at least there would be an outpost of Muslims safe in Abyssinia, away from any imminent troubles or danger. So this was like a backup insurance policy of the Prophet ﷺ, having these people there. The Prophet ﷺ would obviously regularly communicate with them when verses of the Quran came down, and so they would know what was going on, and that communication would often happen through the existing trade routes between the Abyssinians and the Arabs. So Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, he came back with all of the Muslims from Abyssinia, and then as they landed on the shore, they were told that Prophet ﷺ, he's in Khaybar, so they redirected and went to Khaybar. And on the day that the Prophet ﷺ conquered all of Khaybar, Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, he turns up, and the Prophet ﷺ says famously, "I don't know what's made me happier, seeing you after all this time, or conquering the people of Khaybar." And then the Prophet ﷺ gave glad tidings to the people of Abyssinia that they get the benefits of doing two hijras, one to Abyssinia and then one from Abyssinia to the Prophet ﷺ in Medina. So and there was some teasing going on between Umar ibn al-Khattab and one of the Abyssinian ladies. We also talked about Abu Huraira, also known as Abdurrahman ibn Sakhr, from the tribe of Ad-Daws. He'd also migrated from near Yemen, and he was heading towards Medina, found out the Prophet ﷺ was in Khaybar, and obviously redirected and met the Prophet ﷺ in Khaybar, became a Muslim. And again, both the people of Abyssinia were given a share of the booty from Khaybar, and the people from Ad-Daws, they were also given a share of the booty once the Prophet ﷺ had asked permission from the other Muslims if they could be given some of the war booty. The Jewish tribes, they lived in Khaybar until they were expelled under the Khilafah of Umar. And we also talked about the story of Hajjaj bin Ilat, who'd become a Muslim in Khaybar, and then he concocted this plan to get some of the monies owed to him. So he devised this scheme. He went to the Quraysh in Makkah and said, give me your money. And they said, well, what's happening in Khaybar? He says, oh, the Prophet has been badly defeated and he's going to be brought to Makkah to be executed and handed over to you guys. So give me all the money that you owe me, so I can go back and buy the slaves, all the Muslims who've been captured. Obviously Abbas was really upset, but Hajjaj went to him later on and said, look, that was just, had been given permission by the Prophet to say this tall tale because of these reasons, but wait 3 days and then let everyone know the real outcome of Khaybar. And then we just talked about how there was one other small tribe, the tribe of Fadak, which voluntarily surrendered all of their wealth and possessions to the Prophet ﷺ just because they'd seen what had happened in Khaybar. And we said how Khaybar was the largest, most comprehensive military conquest, wealthiest in the Seerah up until that time, and how a lot of the Muslims now actually had some wealth that they hadn't had before, especially the Muhajirun, who were then able to return a lot of the land and property that they'd been given right at the beginning after the Hijrah. They returned it back to the Ansar. And the son of Umar bin al-Khattab, Ibn Umar, he said, we'd never eaten our fill until after Khaybar. So they were always, the first few years in Medina were very rough for them. But only after Khaybar could they actually then start to be a bit more affluent with their wealth and their spending. So, today, inshallah, we'll talk about one of the al-Mu'minin, and that's Saffiyah, who is the Jewish wife of the Prophet ﷺ. And so just going through the wives of the Prophet ﷺ. So, can you name the wives? Khadija, yes. Aisha, yes. Umme Salama, well done. That's 3 out of 10, 3 out of 9 so far. So first one, Khadija, and then she obviously passed away in Makkah, and the Prophet ﷺ, he was very sad, and then the Sahabi in his year of grief said, why didn't you marry someone like Sauda? So he married Sauda, and then he did the nikah with Aisha, and then in Makkah, and then consummated it later on in Medina. And then shortly after moving to Medina, he married Hafsah, the son of Umar bin al-Khattab, and then he married someone called Zainab bint Kuzayma, but then she passed away within 6 to 8 months of being married. So he's, at that time, he's got Sauda, Aisha, Hafsah, and then he married Salama. So that would be his 4th wife. Then we talked about how he married Juwariya, Zainab bint Jahsh, and then Umme Habiba, also known as Ramlah, bint Abu Sufyan, and now this is Saffiyah binti Huyay. Now we've talked about Huyay bin Akhtab many times before. He's cropped up a lot during the Seerah, certainly in the Medinan phase of the Seerah. So Saffiyah, she's the daughter of Huyay, and Huyay, he was put to death when at the end of the Battle of the Trench, because he was from Banu Nadir. He'd actually tried to convince Banu Qurayza that they should disown their treaty with the Prophet ﷺ and fight on behalf of the Confederacy, the alliance, the allies against the Prophet ﷺ. And he managed to convince the Jewish elders of Banu Qurayza to defect. And as part of the agreement, he said, look, I'm so confident that we will win, I will stay with you. But then the Battle of the Trench we talked about, then at the end of that, Prophet ﷺ, before, as he was trying to take off his armor, Jibreel came down and said, why are you taking off your armor when you still haven't sorted out those people over there? So the Prophet ﷺ, he then dispatched the army and said, do not pray Asr until you reach Banu Qurayza. At the end of that siege, the outcome was given by Sa'd bin Mu'adh that all the men, fighting men, should be put to death, and Huyay was amongst them there. So Saffiyah, that was her father, Huyay bin Akhtab. But the first time we heard about Saffiyah, and she's grown up in this very religious atmosphere. Her father's a rabbi. He's one of the chiefs of Banu Nadir. He's very learned. And we talked about it first many months ago when the Prophet ﷺ first entered into Medina. I think this is probably the 75th or 78th Seerah session that we did following the Hijrah. So the Prophet ﷺ, he does Hijrah, and before he enters into Medina, he camps at Quba, builds the first mosque, and then he's just gathering intel and waiting for the right time to, as we said, launch his coup d'etat, take over the authority and leadership in Medina. Whilst he's in Quba, the Jewish tribes and elders, they hear about him, so there's delegation after delegation to see what all the fuss is about. And we talk about how some of the elders amongst the Jews, Abdullah bin Salam, he's the chief rabbi, he converted to Islam. But here's another delegation of Banu Nadir, consisting of Huyay and his brother Abu Yasir. So Saffiyah, again, she's probably about 10, 11 at the time, and she's recounts this story very vividly, that she says, look, I was my father and my uncle's favourite child. And when the Messenger of Allah came to Medina and stayed in Quba, my parents went to see him at night. And then when they came back, they looked disconcerted and worn out. And some of the other descriptions are that their shoulders were dragging. And then I received them cheerfully. So, as a youngster would, she'd, whenever she sees her father coming back from work or wherever, she'll run up to him and sort of be bouncing around, and then he'd be, cheered up and sort of playing with her. And again with her uncle, she says, well, I received them cheerfully, but to my surprise, none of them turned towards me. So basically they ignored her. And she goes that they were so grieved that they did not feel my presence. And again, for a youngster, this is quite a traumatic experience. The first time it's happened in her life. So she vividly remembers this particular conversation. So she's shocked. So then she's just, just sitting there listening to what they're talking about. Why are they treating me like this? And then she says, I heard my uncle, Abu Yasir, saying to my father, Huyay, is it really him? Is it really him? And then his father, Huyay, says, yes, by Allah. So then my uncle, Abu Yasir, said, well, can you recognize him and can you confirm this? And then her father, Huyay, said, yes. So then my uncle said, so how do you feel towards him? What are you going to do? And then Huyay says, by Allah, I shall be his enemy as long as I live. So here you have one of the chief rabbis, Huyay bin Akhtab, Banu Nadir. He's gone, he's met the Prophet, he's recognized him as being a prophet, as being the one who has been mentioned in their books as being the final messenger that's been sent. He sees all these signs, but he's too proud to follow the Prophet ﷺ, probably purely because, and it's narrated in other hadith, that the Prophet ﷺ was sent to the Arabs rather than the Jews. So they were expecting, despite the fact that it's fairly explicit in the books of in the Jewish books, that he will be an Arab prophet, that when the reality came down, their tribalism, their nationalism, their patriotism was such that he just could not take the fact that the prophet was, being sent by God, but sent to a different people. So purely on that racist point, he would not follow the Prophet ﷺ. So it's not a question of Arabs' lives matter, it's Jewish lives matter. So for him, that was the main thing, that because it was a non-Jew, he's not going to follow the Prophet ﷺ. So he said, I will be his enemy till as long as I live. And he lived up to that. And we talked about how Banu Nadir plotted against the Prophet ﷺ, how they would finance campaigns alongside the Quraysh against the Prophet ﷺ. So he lived up to that promise. And this young child, Saffiyah, about 10 or 11, she remembers this conversation vividly. So again, so she's in Medina and they're growing up, and Banu Nadir are there. So, so she hears all of these stories about the Prophet ﷺ, about the Muslims. And again, she's growing up in this environment where she's familiar with what Islam is about and what the Prophet ﷺ is about. It's not new to her. But again, you put yourself in her mind as a young child growing up in that environment. Her father, he's been exiled. Banu Nadir, they were exiled. They had to leave their ancestral homes. So they packed up and put all their wealth on their camels, and they paraded it out. And we talked about this. And they left Medina. So again, for a youngster, that's a really traumatic thing to happen. And then they moved to Khaybar. And again, all this plotting against the Prophet ﷺ, she's in the household where all of this is happening. So she's growing up with an intensely negative attitude towards the Muslims and the Prophet ﷺ. So she's growing up in a hate-filled environment, you could say, where all the propaganda is anti-Islam, anti the Prophet ﷺ. And because that's, Huyay takes it upon himself to be one of the chiefs who is there to undo the legacy of the Prophet ﷺ. So then, whilst they're in Khaybar, she marries someone called Kinanah. And we talked about Kinanah last week and the week before, where they were trying to hide the gold of Huyay bin Akhtab. So she is then betrothed to Kinanah. So she's married him for a few weeks. And then she has a dream. And then in the dream, she sees a brilliant moon hanging in the sky. And it hovers over Medina. Or she says beneath the moon was the city of Medina, or Yathrib. And then the moon began to move towards Khaybar, and then it fell into her lap. And then she woke up and she told her husband, Kinanah, about the dream. As soon as she told her husband she's seen this dream, as a 17-year-old, her husband smacked her in the face, punched her or slapped her, and she ended up with a big bruise on her face. And her husband said, this can only mean that you desire to get married to the king of the Arabs, the king of the Hijaz, Muhammad. So then she recounts that after she got slapped, shortly after that, her menses started, and then the fighting started. So, and then during the fighting, her husband gets killed. And also in the fighting, not only did her husband get killed and her father's been killed, her uncle also is killed during the siege of Khaybar. So her brother, her father, and her husband are all killed. And so, this has all happened within a few weeks of each other. So she's left as an orphan and as a widow. And then on top of that, Banu Nadir, and we talked about this, all the captives that had surrendered right at the end were taken as captives and as war booty and distributed amongst the people. And she was then given to one of the Sahabi, or one of the Sahabi came to the Prophet and said, can I take a slave? And he said, yes, fine. So he took, there's a Sahabi called Dihya al-Kalbi, from the tribe of Al-Qalb, he took Saffiyah as his slave. But then some of the Sahabi came up to the Prophet ﷺ and said, actually, he's taken Saffiyah as a slave, but she's not appropriate to be his slave. She should be your slave because she's the daughter of the chief. So she's of noble blood. So by right, you should have her as your slave rather than her. So the Prophet says, fine, and he beckoned Dihya and said, give her over and take another slave. So the Prophet then paid his share and bought Saffiyah as his slave. And then when the Prophet saw her, or they said that when he had a conversation, he noticed that resolving bruise on her face. So there was that bluey tinge on her face, and he says, what's that? And so she goes to the story that my husband Kinanah gave this to me. I saw a dream that the moon had risen up from Yathrib, gone up high, and then fell into my lap. I told my husband about this, and he smacked me across the face and said, do you expect the king of the Arabs will marry you? Then obviously, so he'd interpreted the dream correctly, and the Prophet again understood that dream, and then he realized that this was a true dream, and that he then needs to marry her. So then the Prophet he took Saffiyah as his slave. So he purchased Saffiyah from Dihya. So ownership goes over to the Prophet and this is as they're about to leave Khaybar. So amongst the Sahabi, they recognize that he's taken Saffiyah, the daughter of Huyay, the chief, as his slave. So then, as they're leaving, they notice that the Prophet ﷺ, he's lowered his camel, and then he's knelt on the floor. So then he kneels on the floor, and then he lifts up one of his legs. So one knee is on the floor, one knee is lifted up. So and then he he's crouched down like that on one knee, doing the knee, and then he asks Saffiyah to step on his knee so she can then climb onto the camel. Which is what happened. But then she doesn't, out of respect, she doesn't want to put her feet on the Prophet's thighs. So she puts her knee on his thigh and then jumps on top of the camel. Again, so there's a lot of protocol happening there, and through that, and then as soon as she jumps onto the camel, then the Prophet ﷺ puts his cloak around Saffiyah, covers her up. So because of all of that protocol, the Sahabi now realize that she is not. The Prophet's intention is not to take her as a slave, but to take her as a wife, because he wouldn't give that level of protocol to a slave. So therefore his intention is to take her as a wife, and obviously he's covering her up as the wives of the prophets are covered up, and that following the hukum that we talked about when the hijab finally came down. So then he has a sort of conversation with Saffiyah. So Saffiyah, she thinks that she's the slave of the Prophet ﷺ. So the Prophet ﷺ then has a conversation with her and says he's prepared to set her free, but he offers her a choice between remaining Jewish, a Jewess, and returning to her people, or entering Islam and staying with him. So the choice essentially, and again this is like a test for her, does she want to remain being a Jewess, in which case he will send her back to her people, or does she want to become a Muslim and stay with her in his mind as his wife, but she's thinking as a slave, because she doesn't know the intention of the Prophet. So then she says, I choose Allah and his messenger. So again, so she's sort of passed the test essentially. So she says, yeah, you know, and this is despite the fact that this is the Prophet ﷺ who, through his actions, has killed her father, her husband, her uncle, or her brother. All of these people have died because of the Prophet ﷺ very recently. Yet she still chooses, you know, him above going back to her people. So then they start their march back, and then again we can see the Prophet thinking obviously to take her as a wife, and this will be, you know, politically very significant for him, you know, and will help sort of reduce hostilities, cement alliances, and again she's of noble extraction. So then, when the first stop happened, so you know, we talked before, you know, Khaybar is a couple of days away from Medina. So on the first stop, the first evening, the Prophet ﷺ, wanted to spend the night with her, but then she refuses, and he said that's fine. And then the next day they carry on traveling, and then they get to the final stop before Medina. So that's the next evening, and the Prophet again, he says he wants to spend the night with her, and then she agrees, and so then the Prophet tells the mother of Anas ibn Malik, and we talk about Anas as one of the leading narrators of hadith, and he asks her to get Saffiyah ready for all the wedding ceremonies, as it were. But then she's panicking because they went out to war. They didn't go out for a wedding, so they don't have any of the wedding stuff. They don't have any jewelry. They don't have any perfume. They don't have any gifts. So she doesn't know what to do. So they do. So she says she put up a little curtain between two trees, and then they did whatever beautification in the beauty salon they could. And then she says that when we finished, we smelt a perfume more beautiful than any other. So obviously this is a miracle from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then Saffiyah, she then you know, she talks about how the interactions between her and the Prophet ﷺ on those first couple of nights. And she said that when the Prophet ﷺ, you know, came to her, you know, the Prophet ﷺ would say, your father Huyay was the most open of the Jews in their animosity against me until Allah caused his death. So again, I mean, it's not the type of thing you would say on a wedding night, you know, that basically your dad was evil and he had it in for me until Allah caused him to die. And again, he's just testing her reactions to see, you know, what her iman is like. So then, you know, again, knowing that she's grown up in Medina and grown up with, you know, what's happening with the Muslims, she then retorts by quoting the Quran and says, doesn't Allah say in the Quran that no soul shall take the burden of another? So basically saying you can't blame me for what my dad did, right? So again, so that's like another little test that the Prophet gave to Saffiyah, and again she passed that. So then, you know, he laid it out plain to her, said, look, you've got a choice: accept Islam, I'll set you free, and if you remain in your faith, then I will set you free, and maybe you can return to your people. But she reiterated that she wants to stay with him. And she replied, Ya Rasulullah, I was already inclined to Islam, and I have already believed in you, and I have no desire to remain in my faith. I don't want to, I accept the fact that, you know, I understand that you're a prophet. I was inclined to Islam anyway, and I have no desire to go back to being Jewish. And then she goes, and now I have no family, and you're asking me to choose between kufr and Islam. Yet Allah and His Messenger are more beloved to me than going back. So again, it's really clever how she constructs her sentences, right? So she's basically saying that, I was already inclined towards Islam. My heart was going in that direction. I already believed in you. And Allah obviously softened her by showing her the dream, right? And then she said, look, I have no desire to remain in that faith. And then she says, besides, I've got no one left. My family have died. And you're asking me to choose between kufr and Islam. So obviously, I'm going to stay with you. So again, you can get a sense of how the way that she replies, that she's grown up in that political environment. She knows how to talk properly. So then they obviously get married, and she later says that the Prophet ﷺ kept apologizing to her by saying, your father charged the Arabs against me and committed heinous crimes, and he apologized to the extent that it made Saffiyah get rid of any bitterness that she had towards Prophet ﷺ. And again, here, this is a wonderful story, where you've got a whole tribe that has been essentially decimated, yet the victors, you've got somebody who's been sort of, whose tribe has been vanquished. Her brother, her uncle, her husband have all been killed by the victor. Yet she willingly chooses to stay, in her mind, as a slave to this victor rather than going back to her own people. And again, this is just the beauty of Islam. So then the Prophet ﷺ asked her later on, why did you refuse to spend the first night with me? And then she replies, well, when we were close by, I was scared that the Jewish tribes would retaliate, so I wanted to get further away. So if she already had this sort of closeness to the Prophet ﷺ, why did she refuse to sanction the first night? And she goes, well, basically we were too close to Khaybar, and then if the people of Khaybar found out, then they because she's the daughter of their chief, she thought that they might retaliate. So then she becomes a loyal Muslimah. The Prophet ﷺ, he freed her, and his meher, his dowry, his gift, wedding gift, was her freedom, and then he married her. And again, we'll talk about some of the fiqh. You don't, when you're marrying those that the right hand possesses, your concubines or your slaves, you don't need, some of the other trappings of marriage. So we'll talk about that later on. So a couple of other things that happened. Abu Ayyub al Ansari, the next morning, that when the Prophet ﷺ got up, he saw Abu Ayyub al Ansari standing by the Prophet ﷺ's tent with his sword in his hand. And so the Prophet says, what are you doing there? And Abu Ayyub says, well, you know who she is, and I'm just here for fear that she would do something bad towards you, because, obviously, they don't know what the conversations that's going on. So it's just a precaution from his side. This is Saffiyah, the daughter of the chief that they've exiled, and her father's been killed, her husband's been killed, her brother's been killed. So he was just there as a precaution. So the Prophet, he burst out laughing and he made a dua for Abu Ayyub al Ansari. And then he sort of made a proclamation and said, whoever's got any food, let them bring it. And this is obviously the walima. So whatever sort of dates, butter, barley stuff that they had, they made a little some cakes or banquet stuff, and they fed everyone. And then obviously they're heading back to Medina now. Prophet ﷺ, he's got her Saffiyah on his camel, and then as they see Medina, they obviously quicken their pace a bit, and as they're quickening their pace, the camel of the Prophet ﷺ tumbles over, trips and falls. So the Prophet ﷺ and Saffiyah, they both get flung from the camel. So they land on the floor, and it's obviously, you know, it's from quite a height, and then everyone, you know, gets frozen. They don't know what to do. But Abu Talha, he cries out, "Are you all right, O Messenger of Allah?" And the Prophet ﷺ replied, "I'm okay, I'm not hurt," and stood up immediately, took off his cloth, his cloak as it were, and covered up Saffiyah. And then they got back onto the camel and then resumed the journey. And it's just one of those beautiful little stories, you know, that just shows, you know, the details that people, you know, preserved, and how the Prophet ﷺ, he's just like any one of us, you know, he's a normal human being. A couple of other stories to sort of finish off in terms of the relationship between the Prophet ﷺ and Saffiyah and the other wives. So some of the other wives, obviously they're going to feel a bit jealous of her. And as soon as the Prophet ﷺ enters into Medina, all the other wives, they run up to check out Saffiyah. And we talked before how it's documented that there are essentially two camps within the wives of the Prophet ﷺ. There's those who are allied to Zainab, bint Jahsh, and those that are allied to Aisha. And so Saffiyah, she's an outsider, so she's not part of the Aisha camp or the Zainab camp. Zainab then remarks to Juwariya that when she sees Saffiyah, that I think this one's going to cause us trouble. So they're feeling a bit jealous, because obviously Saffiyah's, you know, of noble extraction, and she's obviously, you know, clearly beautiful. But then Juwariya, she sort of retorts back to Juwariya and says, "Look, don't worry, she's from a group that doesn't tend to get along with their husbands." Okay, so again, a very disparaging remark, but it's sort of just trying to minimize things and just trying to lessen their animosity. So you can just sort of see a bit of the niggle and banter between the wives of the Prophet ﷺ. And again, we know the Prophet ﷺ, that's the way he is with all his wives. Each of them feel that they are the most special, and he has that you know, relationship with all of his wives. But again, when all the wives are there, they're obviously on a day-to-day basis, they have their own sort of petty rivalries and jealousies. That's just human nature. Another couple of stories related to that is once the Prophet ﷺ was visiting Saffiyah and she was crying, and he goes, "What's the matter?" And she goes, "Well, Hafsah," one of the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, Hafsah said that I'm a binti Yahudi, right? And it was said to her as an insult. So the Prophet said, "Well, why didn't you defend yourself?" And she goes, "Well, how can I defend? You know, what should I say?" And so the Prophet ﷺ, you know, he says, "Well, tell her that your father was a prophet, Harun, because she's from the descendants of Harun. Your uncle was a prophet, Musa, and you're married to a prophet. And so what do they have over you?" Right? So this is his way of trying to console Saffiyah. And it's Saffiyah, she also narrates that the Messenger of Allah went on Hajj with his wives, and on the way my camel knelt down, for it was the weakest amongst all the other camels, so I started crying. So the Prophet ﷺ came up to me and wiped away my tears with his dress in his hands, and he asked me not to weep, and the more he said that, the more I went on weeping. And then he also then turned to Zainab bint Jahsh, who was very wealthy, and she had a lot of extra camels, and he asked Zainab, "Can you lend her one of your camels?" Right? And then Zainab said, "No, why should I give her one of my camels?" Again, out of jealousy, and it's her right to refuse that, but that's what she said. And that obviously, you know, this is Zainab bint Jahsh, and she is obviously very noble, and she said, "Why me? You want me to give my camel to the Yahudiya?" Right? So that was her response, and so the Prophet ﷺ, he got irritated with Zainab bint Jahsh, and it said, you know, as punishment, you know, he withdrew from Zainab for a period of time, following that for a number of weeks, and then, you know, they made up after that. And then another story about Saffiyah is that when the Prophet ﷺ was in his final illness, on his deathbed in the house of Aisha, all the wives, obviously, they came over because he was ill. They didn't know that he's obviously dying, but he was just suffering with a severe illness. So when Saffiyah, she saw the Prophet ﷺ, she began to cry, and then sort of instinctively she said, "Ya Rasulullah, how I wish I could take on your illness. So give your illness to me." And that was her, earnest desire. And sort of, so she was the first of the wives to say something like that. And all the other wives got a bit jealous, and they sort of like mocked her, and sort of like, "Yeah, right, as if" type of tone. And then the Prophet ﷺ, he overheard that, and he got irritated with his wives, and he said, "Go and do wudu and do madmada, and because you have mocked Saffiyah, and wallahi, she has spoken the truth, and you have lied against her." So the Prophet ﷺ knew that this was a genuine, heartfelt sort of expression from her, that she honestly wished that no harm would come to the Prophet ﷺ, that she would take on all the suffering that he was going through. So again, this just shows some of the stories of Saffiyah. And so it said that she lived until 52 Hijri, so another sort of 45 years after this. And this is the 7th year of Hijrah, so the Prophet he's around for 2 or 3 more years before he passes away, and she dies in the time of Muawiyah. So essentially that's most of Khaybar done. Couple of very final sort of a couple of paragraphs. Prophet he was aware that he's going to be away for a period of time. He's dealt with the Quraysh and the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. He's dealing with the Jewish tribes now, and we talked about the triad of enemies. There were the Bedouin hordes that he needed to also tame, and because he's left Medina for quite a period of time, Muharram, Dhul Qa'dah, Dhul Hijjah, there's always a chance that some of these Bedouin tribes would raid attacks, launch attacks on Medina. So then he'd dispatched Aban bin Sa'id as head of a platoon to sort of go and agitate some of the Bedouins so that they don't attack the Prophet ﷺ. So it's sort of a preemptive measures to project strength amongst the Bedouin hordes. And then Aban bin Sa'id, he says that he was successful in his mission in sort of intimidating some of the other Bedouins, and then he successfully joined the Prophet ﷺ in Khaybar after it had been conquered. And a couple of final things is some of the fiqh issues that we talked about during Khaybar, including the Prophet ﷺ, we talked about how he forbade them to eat donkey meat. They were cooking some donkeys, and this is in the early days when they were running short of food. He heard what's that? He could smell some awful smell, and he told them to throw away all the donkey meat that they were boiling, and he made it haram to eat donkey meat. And then we talked about there's the prohibition that if you have a concubine, those that the right hand possesses, you are not allowed to be with her until she's gone through her cycle. And these are the questions that the Prophet was being asked. And this is one of the times, or the first time, we know that Zawaj al-Mutah was made haram. So prior to this, Mutah, or temporary marriage, was something that was practiced by some of the Muslims. And following Khaybar, the Prophet he prohibited temporary marriage, so that you couldn't from now on marry someone for a specified period of time. And again, this is what unanimously all of the scholars of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah believe, although there are obviously other opinions amongst some of the other scholars. But the stronger opinion is that it had been abrogated So Mutah was no longer allowed after Khaybar. And a couple of other technical things around some economic issues. There is something called Riba al-Nas and Riba al-Fadl. So something to do with the interest of commodity. When you buy something for money and you give it back, that's in money in kind. That's Riba al-Fadl, and Islam forbids Riba al-Nas, which is basically giving back wheat, grain, dates, exchanging them for other commodities. When you take wheat, grain, or dates, you're only allowed to give back what you've borrowed in terms of wheat, grain, and dates. And again, there's a story related to how some people brought some luscious dates, some good quality dates, and the Prophet said, are all the dates like this? And they said, look, no, this is the high quality dates, and we exchanged sort of one measure of these for 3 measures of normal dates. And the Prophet said, don't do this, rather sell these good quality dates, or sell the larger quality dates and get the money and use that to buy the better quality dates. So don't exchange different things, you know, sell one and then use that money to buy things, and that's how you should do your transactions. And then finally, there's some we can see, because of the partnership agreement that the Muslims entered following the conquest of Khaybar, whereby the Muslims owned all the land. Then the Jews said, they volunteered that they would farm the land, look after the land, and then of all the produce, they would split 50-50. And this is something called al-Muzara, partnership. The partners have an unequal effort, but they have an agreed share of the profit or the risks. Okay, and Islam allows this, and this is not the same thing as, you know, dealing in stocks and shares. This is a partnership, you know, between different people. So this type of investment is allowed. We'll finish there, inshallah, or just two very quick stories we'll do, because it's to do with Wadi Al-Qura. Prophet ﷺ, he went and then he attacked another Jewish colony in Arabia, mobilized the forces, took 3 regiments with, entrusted the banners to Sa'd bin Ubadah, Al-Hubab bin Al-Mundhir, Abad bin Bishr, and Sal bin Hanif. They went to Wadi Al-Qura. They offered Islam to the Jewish tribes. They refused, and then the fighting started. It said 11 of the Jews were killed, one after the other, and every time one of them was killed, the offer to Islam was freshly made. But that went on for 2 full days, and then after that, the Jewish tribes, they surrendered. So that land was conquered, and the Prophet ﷺ stayed in Wadi Al-Qura for 4 days, distributed booty amongst the fighters, and then they said that the Jews of Taima, they took the initiative and offered to sign a reconciliation treaty, that they would pay jizya to the Prophet ﷺ and in return for protection. And the Prophet ﷺ, he then finally returned, and it said in late Safar or early Rabi' Awwal 7 Hijri. So we'll finish there, inshallah. So do remember us in your du'as, and inshallah we'll do next week, inshallah, where we we'll start off with some of the other minor expeditions, but they're also the next major things are the letters that the Prophet ﷺ writes to the other rulers. Again, we're sort of very familiar with some of these letters, to Heraclius, to the Khusro, to Najashi, but he writes 20 plus letters to various rulers in and around this time pre-Khaybar, but also after Khaybar. But mainly, once the Treaty of Hudaybiyah had been signed, he started writing letters, and we'll talk about that. And then the other major, and we'll bunch all of those letters together. And then the other major thing that happens in the Seerah is the compensatory Umrah, the lesser pilgrimage, which was a year after Hudaybiyah, where the Treaty of Hudaybiyah said, you can come and do Umrah in a year's time, we'll vacate it. So these are the next big stories, inshallah. So, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. وَلَسَلْ إِنسَانٌ فِي خُسْرٍ إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. جزاك الله خير. Assalamu alaikum.